The $1 Saloon reeked of tobacco juice and desperation on that sweltering July evening in 1873. Esther McKinnon positioned her wooden wheelchair beside the scarred upright piano, its mahogany finish dulled by countless spilled drinks and cigarette burns. At 17, she had grown accustomed to the stares, some pitying, others merely curious about the contraption Doc Whitaker had crafted, when childhood fever left her legs weak as wilted wheat. Her fingers found the keys with practiced ease, while her left hand gripped the slim wooden lever Doc had rigged with cord and pulley to the piano's sustain pedals. Tonight, she played a haunting melody her grandmother Astrid had taught her something about winter and memory. Though Astrid's Norwegian accent made the original words difficult to decipher. "Play something lively, cripple girl," bellowed Brock Hollister, a thick-set cattle buyer whose breath carried the sour tang of rot-gut whiskey. His companions, 3 other drovers, flush with silver from selling beef to the territorial army, erupted in drunken laughter. Esther's jaw tightened, but she continued playing. The $1 was the only establishment in Crow's Landing that paid her to perform, and she needed every cent. The town had withered since Silas Boone dammed Rabbit Ear Creek to power his stamp mills, leaving residents with water that tasted of rust and minerals. Worse than the taste was what the contamination had brought. Cholera had claimed 3 families last month, and livestock were dying with swollen tongues and bloody foam at their mouths. "I said play something with spirit." Hollister lurched forward, his meaty hand slamming down on her delicate lever mechanism. The sudden jolt sent discord through the strings, and Esther winced as the carefully balanced system jarred loose. From the shadows near the back wall, a lean figure straightened. Dakota had chosen that corner table because it afforded clear views of both entrances while keeping his back to solid wood. In his younger seasons, he had hired on with a mining outfit west of the Black Hills, swinging a pick by day and fetching powder for the Irish blasters by night. Earlier that week, the agency clerk had quietly dispatched a rider to the nearest cavalry picket at Fort Randall, carrying a letter under the agent's seal about water rights tampering and missing ledgers. By the time events in Crow's Landing came to a boil, a patrol was already nosing along the river bottoms within a day's ride, waiting on a signal. That is why, when the call finally came, their arrival felt swift rather than conjured. A foreman named O'Dowd taught him the plain rules of blasting: measure the seam drill fair tamp with wet clay, mind the wind, and never trust a fuse you did not cut yourself. Ever since, Dakota kept a thumb-worn scrap of figures in his pouch, ratios of charge to stone, not a showy skill, but the kind a man files away for the day it matters. At 28, the Lakota translator for the Indian Agency carried himself with the fluid economy of a man who had survived too many winters and buried too many loved ones. The melody stopped him cold. For an instant, he was no longer in the smoky saloon, but in a canvas teepee on the wind-swept plains, watching his wife Ayanna hum this same tune to their twin daughters as snow whispered against the buffalo hide walls. She had called it the Song of Remembering, passed down through her grandmother's line. The smallpox that claimed them 6 months ago had taken more than his family. It had stolen the only connection he had to that sacred music. Until now. Hollister raised his hand to strike the lever again, but Dakota moved with lethal silence. His fingers closed around the drover's thick wrist, applying pressure to nerve points his father had taught him during boyhood hunting lessons. "The lady is playing," Dakota said quietly, his English precise despite the slight accent that marked him as agency educated. "Sit down." Hollister's face purpled as Dakota's grip tightened. The other drovers started to rise hands, moving toward gun belts, but found themselves staring into flint, hard eyes that held no fear, only the patient calculation of a man who had killed when necessity demanded it. "Let go of me, you red devil," Hollister snarled, trying to jerk free. Instead, Dakota simply shifted his grip and applied downward pressure, forcing the larger man to his knees beside Esther's wheelchair. The piano never stopped. Esther's hands moved across the keys with steady precision, though her pulse raced like a startled Mustang. She had never seen anyone move like the Lakota man. No wasted motion, no theatrical posturing. Just efficient, controlled violence that spoke of hard experience. One of Hollister's companions, a scraggly man with tobacco-stained teeth, swung a whiskey bottle at Dakota's head. Without releasing Hollister's wrist, Dakota sidestepped and hooked his free leg behind the attacker's knee, sending him crashing into the sawdust-covered floor. The bottle shattered against a chair leg, spraying amber liquid across the room. Enough. May Delaney's voice cut through the chaos as she emerged from behind the bar with a sawed-off shotgun. The twin hammers were already cocked, and her finger rested easy on the front trigger. This establishment serves drinks and music, not brawls. Any man looking for a fight can take it to the street. A chair flew through the air, missing Esther's face by inches before splintering against the wall. May's shotgun roared, sending buckshot into the ceiling and raining down splinters of wood. In the sudden silence that followed, Dakota moved again this time to engage the brake on Esther's wheelchair with the toe of his moccasin, then position himself between her and the remaining drovers. His broad back pressed against her shoulder as she continued to play her fingers, drawing deliberate, calming chords from the piano to mask the tremor in her hands. For a moment, their breathing synchronized, his steady and controlled hers, gradually slowing to match his rhythm. She caught the scent of sage and wood smoke that clung to his buckskin shirt, so different from the stale beer and unwashed bodies that usually surrounded her performances. "You boys got about 10 seconds to collect your friend and find the door." May announced, her shotgun now trained on the remaining drovers. "Or I can introduce you to my other barrel." Hollister struggled to his feet, cradling his wrist and shooting venomous glances at both Dakota and Esther. "This ain't finished," he muttered. "Yes, it is," Dakota replied simply. He had not drawn the army Colt on his hip, but his hand rested near the grip with casual readiness. "Walk away." The drovers gathered their groaning companion and stumbled toward the batwing doors, trailing curses and threats. May kept the shotgun trained on them until they disappeared into the dusty street, then carefully lowered the hammers and set the weapon aside. Esther's hands finally stilled on the keys. She turned in her wheelchair to look at the man who had intervened on her behalf, taking in his angular features and the silver-threaded horsehair charm that hung from his belt. His hair was braided in the traditional style, but shorter than full custom, another mark of his position between cultures. "That song," he said quietly, studying her face with penetrating bronze eyes. "Where did you learn it?" "My grandmother taught it to me." Esther replied, surprised by the intensity of his gaze. "She said it was old from before she came to this territory." "Why?" Before Dakota could answer, the saloon doors swung open again. This time it was Doc Whitaker, his medical bag in one hand, and his weathered face creased with concern. "Heard gunfire." The elderly physician set his eyes, quickly taking in the scattered glass and overturned chairs. "Anyone hurt?" "Just some bruised pride and a sore wrist," May said. "Though I suspect there'll be more trouble brewing. Those drovers work for Silas Boone's outfit, and he don't take kindly to his people being shown up." Dakota moved away from Esther's wheelchair, the protective stance broken. But something had shifted in the saloon's atmosphere, an awareness that alliances had been drawn and lines established. As Esther began packing her sheet music, her fingers brushed against the damaged lever mechanism, and she suppressed a sigh. Doc's ingenious pulley system would need repairs she couldn't afford. "Let me look at that," Dakota said, kneeling beside the wheelchair. His hands were gentle as he examined the bent wood and loosened cord. "Can be fixed. Not tonight, but soon." Their eyes met briefly, and Esther felt something flutter in her chest, that had nothing to do with the earlier violence. There was kindness in his weathered face, but also a guardedness that spoke of recent grief. She had seen the same look in the mirror during the long months after her fever, when she first understood that her life would be different from other girls her age. "Thank you," she said simply, "for stopping them. You didn't have to." "Music should not be silenced," Lakota replied, rising to his feet. He paused as if weighing his next words carefully. "That song, it reminds me of my family, of people I have lost." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile as spun glass. Then May was bustling over with her broom, and Doc was checking Esther for injuries, and the moment passed. But as Lakota helped transfer her from the wheelchair to Doc's waiting buggy for the ride home, Esther felt the warmth of his hands longer than strictly necessary. Outside Crow's Landing sweltered under a canopy of stars that seemed dimmed by the dust and smoke hanging over the settlement. The drought had lasted 3 months now, ever since Boone completed his dam project. Wells that had run clear for decades now yielded water that tasted of metal and minerals when they yielded anything at all. "Storm coming," Doc observed, though the sky showed no clouds. "Can feel it in my bones, and I don't mean weather." As they rolled down Main Street, Esther glanced back to see Lakota still standing outside the saloon watching their departure. The sight stirred something unexpected in her chest. Not gratitude exactly, but a sense of connection she hadn't felt since her parents died in the influenza outbreak of '69. "Interesting evening," Doc said quietly, his experienced hands guiding the horse around the worst ruts. That young man showed considerable courage back there. "He said the song reminded him of his family," Esther said. "Grandmother's melody. How could a Lakota warrior know a Norwegian lullaby?" Doc was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Your grandmother's been in this territory a long time, child. Longer than most folks realize. Sometimes the stories we tell ourselves about our own histories ain't quite complete." They pulled up outside the small frame house Esther shared with Astrid, one of the few structures in Crow's Landing that showed signs of careful maintenance. Doc helped transfer Esther back to her wheelchair and then waited while she navigated the wooden ramp he had built to the front door. Inside, oil lamps cast warm circles of light across hand-sewn quilts and carefully arranged furniture. Astrid McKinnon sat in her rocking chair, her silver hair braided in the old country style, working at a piece of intricate beadwork despite her failing eyesight. At 54, she remained vigorous, despite the harsh frontier life, though her lungs bore the scars of too much smoke and dust. "Esther Cara," she said in her accented English, setting aside her work. "I heard the guns. Are you safe?" "A man stood up for me, grandmother, a Lakota translator. He said my playing reminded him of his family." Astrid's weathered hands stilled on the beadwork. In the lamplight, her pale eyes held shadows of old secrets. "Did he now? And what song were you playing, child?" "The winter song, the one you taught me when I was small." Astrid was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on something beyond the lamp's reach. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades. "Some songs travel farther than we know, Esther." She reached for a small cedar box on the side table, its surface worn smooth by countless handlings. "Perhaps it is time you knew more about where that song truly comes from." But before she could open the box, a fit of coughing seized her, not the harsh, rattling spasms of lung disease, but something milder that spoke more of emotion than illness. Esther moved her wheelchair quickly to her grandmother's side, offering a tin cup of their carefully rationed water. "Rest now," Esther said gently. "Morning will be soon enough for old stories." As she helped Astrid to bed and banked the fire for the night, Esther's mind kept returning to the moment in the saloon when Lakota had pressed his back against her shoulder. The gesture had been protective, but also strangely intimate, as if they were partners in some unspoken understanding. Outside, the night wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain that might never come. In the darkness beyond Crow's Landing, forces were already moving, plans being laid, debts being called in, and old secrets stirring like dust devils on the prairie. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Crow's Landing's dusty streets, promising another day of temperatures that would crack lips and wither what little remained of kitchen gardens. Esther maneuvered her wheelchair carefully down the wooden ramp Doc Whitaker had constructed, mindful of the uneven boards that could catch her wheels if she wasn't cautious. The town itself bore the marks of Silas Boone's stranglehold on the water supply. Where once Rabbit Ear Creek had run clear and strong through the settlement's heart, now only a muddy trickle remained tainted with the metallic residue from the stamp mills that crushed ore day and night at the Black Elk mine. The creek bed had become a testament to withered dreams, cracked earth stretching between skeletal cottonwoods that still reached hopefully toward the sky. Main Street stretched before her like a study in perseverance and quiet desperation. The buildings constructed hastily during the territory's brief gold boom now showed the wear of harsh winters and harsher summers. Paint peeled from storefronts, and more than one establishment bore weathered boards over windows that marked failed enterprises. Yet life persisted. Eli Turner, whose farm lay 2 miles east of town, guided his wagon down Main Street with the measured pace of a man conserving his horse's strength. His 2 sons, Matthew and Luke, flanked him on the seat boys of 15 and 13, who had grown lean and serious beyond their years. In the wagon bed, half-barrels of precious water gleamed like liquid silver. "Morning, Miss McKinnon," Eli called, touching the brim of his hat. "How's your grandmother faring?" "Well enough," Esther replied, though the contaminated water had been giving Astrid persistent stomach troubles. "Is that creek water?" Eli's weathered face tightened. "What passes for it these days?" "Found a seep about 5 miles upstream from Boone's Dam. Cleaner than what flows through town, but not by much." He gestured toward the barrels. "Doc Whitaker gets first priority, got 3 women about to deliver, and they'll need clean water for washing. After that, Mrs. Delaney at the Silver Dollar, then whoever can pay." The economics of drought were simple and brutal. Water meant survival, and survival carried a price that grew steeper with each rainless day. The contaminated supply had already claimed Mrs. Henderson's prize bull and left half the children in town with persistent stomach ailments that Doc couldn't seem to cure. Before Esther could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 5 riders approached from the north, hard men with dust-caked clothes and the easy confidence of those who carried authority in their holsters. She recognized Deputy Marcus Rusk, a thick-bodied man whose loyalty to Marshal Greeley was matched only by his casual cruelty toward anyone who couldn't fight back. Behind Rusk rode Brock Hollister and his 3 companions from the previous evening, though the cattle buyer now sported a splinted wrist and a complexion mottled with bruises. The 5th rider was unfamiliar, a lean man in a black suit whose pale eyes surveyed the town with the calculating gaze of a professional predator. "Trouble coming." Eli muttered, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle scabbarded beside his seat. The riders reined in before the small group, their horses snorting and stamping in the dust. Rusk's gaze fixed on Esther with undisguised malice. "Miss McKinnon," he said, his voice carrying false courtesy. "Hear you had some excitement at the Silver Dollar last night. Seems a certain redskin took exception to some honest citizens enjoying your musical talents." "I saw men threatening a young woman," Doc Whitaker said firmly, emerging from his office across the street with his medical bag in hand. "And another man, who had the courage to intervene when law enforcement was notably absent. Rusk's face darkened, but the man in black spoke before the deputy could respond. "Dr. Whitaker, isn't it I'm Samuel Cross representing certain business interests in the territory? I understand you've been corresponding with federal authorities regarding water quality in this area." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Doc straightened slightly, his medical bag held like a shield before him. "I report what I observe," he said. "If territorial waters are showing contamination levels dangerous to human health, that's a matter for proper authorities to address." "Of course," Cross said smoothly, "though sometimes outside interference can complicate local solutions to local problems. Wouldn't you agree, Deputy Horbrum Bortier?" As Cross spoke, he reached into his coat for what appeared to be official papers. A folded letter slipped from his pocket and fluttered to the ground. The envelope bore an ornate bee seal that made several observers exchange meaningful glances as the Boone family crest was well known throughout the territory. From the direction of the Indian Agency came the sound of a single horse moving at an easy lope. Lakota appeared around the corner of the general store, mounted on a rangy bay gelding that moved with the fluid grace of a well-trained plains horse. He wore the same buckskin shirt and dark trousers as the night before. But now, a Winchester repeater rested across his saddle pommel, not pointed at anyone, but unmistakably present. "Gentlemen," he said politely, reining in near Esther's wheelchair. His position was carefully chosen close enough to intervene if needed, but not so close as to appear threatening. "Fine morning for conducting business." Hollister's face flushed red above his splinted wrist. "You got some nerve showing your face after last night." "My name is Lakota," came the quiet reply. "Last night I prevented an assault on a defenseless woman. This morning I'm ensuring no similar incidents occur." Cross studied Lakota with the cold attention of a man evaluating an opponent, then retrieved his fallen letter with casual efficiency. But Dakota's keen eyes had already noted the family seal, and his expression hardened with understanding. "You seem very concerned with protecting this particular young lady," Cross said. "Perhaps you have personal motivations that cloud your judgment." The suggestion hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. In the territorial West of 1873, the mere hint of romantic involvement between a white woman and an Indian man could spark violence that would consume innocent lives. Esther felt heat rise in her cheeks, but not from embarrassment. The implication was meant to isolate her, to make her toxic to potential allies by suggesting impropriety. "Mr. Dakota's motivations seem perfectly clear to me," she said firmly. "He sees wrong being done and acts to prevent it. I wish more men in this territory possessed such straightforward moral courage." Cross's pale eyes fixed on her with something that might have been recognition. "Careful words, Miss McKinnon. Accusations of moral deficiency might be seen as slanderous by some parties." "Stating facts ain't slander," Eli Turner said from his wagon seat. His sons had quietly moved to positions where they could reach the weapons stored beneath the water barrels. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. 5 mounted men against a disabled woman, an elderly doctor, a farmer, and his boys, and a lone Lakota translator. But Cross appeared to recognize something in their opponent's demeanor that gave him pause. "Perhaps," he said finally, "we should continue this conversation at a more appropriate time and place." He touched his hat brim in mockery of courtesy. "Good day, Dr. Whitaker. Miss McKinnon, I'm certain we'll have occasion to speak again soon." The riders moved off toward the silver dollar, but their departure felt like tactical repositioning rather than retreat. After they disappeared, Lakota dismounted and moved to examine her wheelchair's mechanism more closely. That seal, he said quietly, his hands working on the damaged pulley system. Boone family crest. Cross isn't just representing business interests, he's blood kin. How can you be certain? Esther asked. Because I've seen that crest before on documents at the Indian Agency. The Boone family has been filing mineral claims in this territory for 30 years, often on land that should be protected under federal treaties. His expression was grim. Cross being here means they're planning something bigger than intimidating local witnesses. As he worked on her wheelchair, Esther found herself studying his profile. The strong line of his jaw, the careful concentration in his storm-gray eyes, the way his braided hair caught the morning light. There was something about his presence that made her feel safer, more grounded. "This will hold for now," he said, testing the repaired mechanism. "But you should be careful. Men like Cross don't make threats lightly." "Will you walk me home?" she asked impulsively, then immediately felt foolish for the request. "Of course," he replied simply, as if there had never been any question. The short journey to her house passed mostly in comfortable silence. But as they approached the front porch, Lakota suddenly tensed his hand, moving instinctively toward his weapon. "What is it?" Esther asked. "The door," he said quietly. "It's standing open. Didn't you latch it when you left?" Esther's blood turned to ice water. Astrid never left the door open. Her Norwegian upbringing had instilled habits of security that 40 years on the frontier had only reinforced. "Grandmother?" Esther called, but received no answer. Lakota dismounted and approached the house with the fluid caution of a hunter stalking dangerous prey. He gestured for Esther to remain quiet, then peered through the open doorway into the dim interior. What he saw there made his jaw tighten with barely controlled anger. Astrid sat in her rocking chair, but her hands were bound behind her back with rough rope, and Deputy Rusk stood behind her, with his service revolver pressed against the base of her skull. Samuel Cross occupied the center of the room, holding a small cedar box that he was examining with obvious satisfaction. "Ah, Miss McKinnon," Cross called out, having spotted movement on the porch. "How considerate of you to return home. Please come in. And bring your Indian friend. We wouldn't want him to miss the evening's entertainment." Lakota's hand was already on his Colt, but Cross anticipated the movement. "I wouldn't if I were you," he said pleasantly. "Deputy Rusk has an unfortunately nervous disposition, and accidents do happen to elderly Norwegian women who keep dangerous secrets." With no other choice, Lakota and Esther entered the house. Cross gestured toward the center of the room with theatrical courtesy. "Please make yourselves comfortable. We have much to discuss." He held up the cedar box. "Such as the fascinating historical documents your grandmother has been keeping. Documents that paint a rather unflattering picture of certain business practices in this territory." "I don't know what you're talking about," Esther said, though her heart was beating so hard she felt certain everyone could hear it. Cross opened the box and withdrew a small leather-bound notebook filled with careful handwriting. 40 years of observations, Miss McKinnon. Dates, places, names. A meticulous record of crimes that certain powerful men thought were safely buried in the past." He began reading from the notebook in a mocking tone. June 15th, 1835. Witnessed J. Cross shoot Federal Surveyor Wilson near Rabbit Ear Creek. Body weighted and sunk in deep pool. Claims filed under false name 3 days later. Astrid's pale eyes blazed with defiant fury despite her helpless position. "That's right, you murdering snake. I saw your father kill that man in cold blood, then steal his land claims. I've been documenting your family's crimes ever since." The admission sent shockwaves through the room. Cross's face went pale while Rusk shifted nervously behind Astrid's chair. "You were 17 in 1835, Cross said slowly, doing the arithmetic. "That would make you... My God, you're only 54. You've been carrying this secret for nearly 40 years. Waiting for the right moment," Astrid confirmed. "Waiting for honest men to arrive who might actually see justice done." Cross's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "Justice, you pathetic old fool. There's no justice here, only power and the will to use it." He gestured to Rusk. "Kill her, both of them. Make it look like the Indian went savage and murdered two defenseless white women." But as Rusk's finger tightened on the trigger, Astrid did something that stunned everyone in the room. She began to speak in fluent Lakota, her voice carrying the formal cadences of ceremonial speech. "Tungkang washte, protect these children, as you protected me when I was young and lost. Let my death have meaning, as my life has had purpose." Dakota's eyes widened in shock. You speak our language." "I am Lakota," Astrid said, simply continuing in English now. "Adopted daughter of Red Standing, raised in the traditional ways until traders took me away in 1835. The winter song Esther plays, it's not Norwegian at all. It's the lineage song of Red Standing's family line." The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Cross stared at Astrid with new understanding, while Dakota's face showed wonder and recognition. "Red Standing was my great-grandmother," he said softly. "That makes you..." "Family," Astrid confirmed. "And this child," she nodded toward Esther, "carries Red Standing's blood through my line." In the moment of stunned silence that followed, Dakota moved. His Colt cleared leather with practiced speed, but Cross was already diving for cover behind the heavy oak table. Rusk's shot went wide as Astrid threw herself sideways, toppling her chair and tangling the deputy's legs. "Get the notebook!" Cross shouted, scrambling for his own weapon. Esther acted on pure instinct. Her wheelchair shot forward, ramming into Rusk's knees and sending him stumbling backward into the stone fireplace. His head struck the hearth with a sickening crack, and he dropped without another sound. But Cross had regained his footing and his gun. "Nobody moves." He snarled, his weapon trained on Esther. "The girl dies first, then the old woman, then..." Dakota's bullet took him center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to the wooden floor. But even as he fell, Cross managed one final shot. The bullet splintered the wooden frame of Esther's wheelchair, and suddenly she was tumbling to the floor in a tangle of wheels and leather straps. Pain shot through her left shoulder as she hit the hardwood, and for a moment her vision blurred with shock and impact. Through the chaos, she could hear Astrid's voice raised in what sounded like a Lakota victory song, words of triumph and justice finally served. "Are you hurt?" Dakota asked urgently, kneeling beside her to check for injuries. "Bruised but breathing," she managed, though her voice shook with delayed reaction. The lieutenant explained, almost sheepish, that the patrol had been put on quiet notice days ago. They had simply been waiting for proof they could carry back to the colonel. "Is he dead?" Dakota checked Cross's pulse, then nodded grimly. "Justice has been served, though not the way we might have hoped." As they helped Astrid free herself from the ropes, the elderly woman's hands trembled not with fear, but with relief at finally unburdening herself of secrets carried for 4 decades. "The notebook tells the whole story," she said, pressing the leather volume into Esther's hands. "Names, dates, witnesses to crimes that go back to the early days of territorial settlement. Cross's father and Silas Boone built their empire on murder and theft, always making their victims disappear so no questions would be asked." "Why didn't you speak before now?" Esther asked. Who would believe an immigrant woman against the most powerful family in the territory? Astrid replied with bitter wisdom. But now, with federal authorities asking questions and honest men willing to stand up. She gestured toward the notebook. Now the truth might actually matter. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Captain Morrison and a squad of federal cavalry appeared in the doorway, drawn by the gunfire and ready for immediate action. "We heard shots," Morrison said, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. "Are you folks all right?" "Better than all right," Lakota replied, indicating Cross's body and the notebook in Esther's hands. "We've got evidence of 40 years of systematic corruption and murder." The next several hours passed in a blur of official statements, medical examinations, and tactical preparations. Doc Whitaker pronounced Esther bruised but not seriously injured, while Astrid's remarkable resilience seemed barely affected by the evening's violence. More importantly, the notebook's contents provided exactly the evidence federal authorities needed to dismantle the entire network of corruption that had strangled the Dakota Territory for decades. But it was the personal revelations that would reshape Esther's understanding of herself. As dawn broke over Crow's Landing, she sat beside Lakota on the porch of Doc's office. The cedar box's contents spread between them like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. "Red Standing was my great-grandmother," Lakota said quietly, his fingers tracing the pictographic symbols on a strip of hide marked with traditional Lakota calendar notations. "These records show your grandmother as her adopted daughter, which makes us family in ways that transcend blood." "Family," Esther repeated the word, carrying weight she was only beginning to understand. "That's why you knew the song. It wasn't Norwegian at all." "It's a lineage song," Lakota confirmed. "Passed down through Red Standing's line for generations. Your grandmother kept it alive even after she was taken from us." The implications were staggering and wonderful. She wasn't just a disabled piano player scraping by on the margins of society. She was part of a heritage that stretched back through generations of strong women who had survived everything the frontier could throw at them. But even as she absorbed these revelations, Captain Morrison approached with news that brought their attention back to immediate dangers. "Cross's death won't end this," he reported grimly. "Our intelligence suggests Silas Boone is preparing to destroy the dam rather than allow federal authorities to examine his operation. If he triggers a catastrophic failure, it would flood half the territory." Lakota finished. "Wash away evidence and witnesses alike." "How long do we have?" Esther asked. "Hours, maybe less. Our scouts report significant activity around the dam site, men with explosives, and the kind of equipment you'd use to bring down the entire structure." Esther felt her blood turn to ice water. Before he set a single cap, Lakota tested the breeze with a pinch of dust, cut the fuses to honest lengths, and packed each hole with wetted clay, so the powder would push the stone instead of spitting fire. He angled the charges toward a weak seam he had read in the rock face, wanting a breach that bled the reservoir rather than a wild shatter. Catastrophic dam failure would wash away not just evidence, but entire communities downstream. Crow's Landing sat directly in the path. Any such flood would take, and evacuation would be nearly impossible given the number of elderly residents and families with small children. "There's another option," she said quietly, an idea forming that was either brilliant or suicidal. "What if we could reach the dam first, sabotage their sabotage?" Morrison shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous. My orders are to protect federal witnesses, not send them into harm's way." "With respect, Captain," Esther replied, "your witnesses won't survive if that dam fails catastrophically. But if someone who knows the terrain could reach the structure before Boone's men finish their preparations. You're 17 years old and in a wheelchair, Morrison pointed out with brutal honesty. How exactly do you propose to navigate rough country and outmaneuver armed men? Through Hidden Canyon, she said simply. It's a route to the dam's upstream face that Boone's men won't expect anyone to use. Narrow, dangerous, but it offers the only chance to reach them before they can trigger the explosives. The plan that emerged from their desperate conference was indeed dangerous, but it offered the only hope of preventing disaster. While Morrison's cavalry created a diversion by approaching the dam from the main road, Esther and Lakota would use their knowledge of the terrain to reach the structure through Hidden Canyon, a narrow gorge that offered concealment but demanded technical climbing skills. The wheelchair won't work in the canyon, Lakota said, as they prepared for what might be their final gambit. I'll have to carry you for the technical sections. I can handle that, Esther replied, though her pulse quickened at the thought of being so completely dependent on another person's strength and judgment. As they made their way toward Hidden Canyon in the pre-dawn darkness, Esther found herself acutely aware of every sound, every shadow, every potential threat that might emerge from the broken country around them. Her wheelchair navigated the rough ground better than expected, but she knew the truly difficult terrain lay ahead. Hidden Canyon proved to be everything its name suggested, a narrow cleft in the sandstone cliffs that seemed designed to swallow travelers without a trace. The entrance was barely wide enough for two people walking single file, and within 50 yards, it narrowed further to a passage that would challenge even experienced climbers. From here we go on foot, Lakota said, studying the route ahead. Or rather, I go on foot and you travel as cargo. The arrangement was both humbling and terrifying. Esther had spent years learning to navigate the world from her wheelchair, developing independence and self-reliance that defined her sense of identity. Now she would be reduced to helpless passenger trusting Lakota's strength and skill to carry them both through terrain that could kill with a single misstep. Ready? He asked, shouldering her slight weight with practiced ease. As ready as I'll ever be, she replied, wrapping her arms around his neck. The climb that followed tested every resource of courage and endurance both of them possessed. Hidden Canyon was a maze of narrow ledges, vertical rock faces, and passages where the walls closed to barely shoulder width. Lakota proved incredibly strong and sure-footed, but even his skills were challenged by terrain that seemed designed to repel human intrusion. Worse than the physical difficulties were the natural hazards. Loose rock constantly threatened to give way under their weight, sending cascades of stone into an echoing depths below. Wind funneled through the canyon with unpredictable force, strong enough to throw a climber off balance at the worst possible moment. And always there was the awareness that they were racing against time. Every minute spent in the canyon was a minute closer to catastrophic destruction. Patrol ahead, Lakota whispered, pressing against the canyon wall as voices echoed from somewhere above them. Two of Boone's men were moving along the rim, and their rifles ready as they swept the surrounding terrain for signs of Federal approach. The guards were positioned to command the main approaches to the dam, but they hadn't anticipated anyone attempting to reach the structure through Hidden Canyon. Can we get past them? Esther asked quietly. If we're very quiet and very lucky, Lakota replied. The next section is the most exposed if they look down at the wrong moment. They waited in tense silence as the guards completed their patrol circuit and moved on to other positions. Then Lakota began the most dangerous traverse, yet a narrow ledge that ran along the canyon wall with a 100-foot drop to jagged rocks below. Esther closed her eyes and concentrated on breathing steadily, trying not to think about what would happen if Lakota's foot slipped or if loose rock gave way beneath them. She could feel the tremor in his muscles as he fought to maintain balance, could hear his controlled breathing as he navigated each treacherous step. "Almost there," he murmured, though whether for her comfort or his own was unclear. The ledge ended at another vertical section, a rock face that would have challenged experienced climbers with proper equipment. Lakota attacked it with grim determination, finding handholds that seemed impossibly small and footholds that crumbled under pressure. Halfway up, the face disaster struck. A section of rock gave way beneath Lakota's left hand, sending a shower of stone into the depths below. For a terrifying moment, he hung by his remaining grip, while Esther's weight threatened to pull them both into the abyss. "Can you reach that outcrop?" he asked through gritted teeth, nodding toward a small ledge just within her grasp. Esther stretched desperately, her fingers closing around solid stone, just as Lakota's remaining handhold began to crumble. For several heartbeats, they hung suspended by her grip, alone her hands supporting not just her own weight, but his as well. Then Lakota found a new purchase, and they were climbing again, both of them shaking with delayed reaction to how close death had come. "Next time," Esther gasped, "let's take the main road." "Next time," Lakota replied, "we're staying home." They reached the canyon's end, just as the sun cleared the eastern hills, revealing the full scope of Boone's preparations. The mining kingpin had indeed assembled a private army, perhaps 30 armed men positioned around the dam structure with enough explosives to destroy not just the facility, but half the canyon wall above it. From their concealed position on a narrow ledge overlooking the dam, they could see Silas Boone himself directing the final preparations. The mining magnate had clearly abandoned any pretense of legitimacy. His clothes were those of a man prepared for extended wilderness survival, and his demeanor carried the desperate ruthlessness of someone with nothing left to lose. "Federal cavalry approaching from the south," one of his men reported. "Full company, maybe more." Boone's laugh was harsh as sandpaper. "Let them come. By the time they reach the dam, there won't be a dam left to reach." He gestured toward the charges placed along the structure's foundation. "Light them all. Maximum destruction." "Sir, that much explosive will bring down the whole canyon wall. We won't have time to get clear ourselves." "Then we die like men instead of hanging like dogs," Boone snarled. "Light the charges." Esther watched in horror as men began moving toward the carefully placed explosives, carrying lit torches that would ignite fuses calculated to give them just enough time to reach minimum safe distance. The mathematical precision of mass murder unfolding below made her stomach clench with nausea. "How long do we have?" she whispered. Lakota studied the fuse lengths with experienced eyes. 5 minutes for the shortest, maybe 8 for the longest. More than enough time for them to get clear, not nearly enough for us to climb back out of the canyon. "Then we don't climb out," Esther said quietly. "We go down." The plan that crystallized in her mind was desperate beyond reason, but it offered the only chance to prevent disaster. The dam's water intake system included a large metal pipe that carried water from the reservoir to the stamp mills downstream. If they could redirect some of the explosive charges, turn their own destruction against them, Lakota said, following her reasoning. Channel the blast through the intake pipe, create a controlled failure that drains the reservoir gradually instead of catastrophically. "But we'd have to reach the charges before the fuses burn down," Esther pointed out. "And we'd have no way out ourselves." The first torch touched the first fuse, and a bright spark began racing toward enough explosives to level a city block. Time compressed around them like a closing fist, 5 minutes to save thousands of lives, with no guarantee they would survive the attempt. "I'm going," Esther said simply. "Not alone," Dakota replied, already preparing for the descent that would take them down to the dam structure. Never alone. The rappel to the dam's foundation was the longest 2 minutes of Esther's life. Dakota carried her on his back as he descended the canyon wall on a rope that seemed impossibly thin for their combined weight. Below them, Boone's men were already withdrawing to what they hoped was safe distance, leaving their employer's final gambit to unfold without witnesses. 40 seconds on the shortest fuse. Dakota called as they reached the dam's concrete foundation. Maybe less. Working with desperate efficiency, they began repositioning the explosive charges from their original locations along the dam wall to new positions around the water intake pipe. The plan was sound in theory channel, the blast force through the metal conduit creating a controlled breach that would drain the reservoir while leaving the main structure intact. 30 seconds. Esther announced, her hands shaking as she helped position the final charge. The sparks were clearly visible, now racing along their predetermined paths toward destruction that would reshape the entire region. 20 seconds. Dakota grabbed her around the waist and dove toward a concrete maintenance shed just as the world exploded around them. The blast was indescribable, not just sound, but physical force that seemed to tear the air itself apart. Concrete fragments whined overhead like bullets, and the ground shook as if the earth itself was coming apart. But instead of catastrophic destruction, their sabotage had worked exactly as planned. The redirected charges had blown out the intake pipe in a controlled breach that sent reservoir water rushing through the canyon in a torrent that scoured everything clean, while leaving the main dam structure largely intact. The roar of rushing water was deafening, but above it they could hear human voices raised in panic and pain. Boone's carefully planned retreat had not accounted for the changed blast pattern. Several of his men were caught in the flood zone, their screams cut short by tons of rushing water. "Are you hurt?" Dakota asked urgently, checking Esther for injuries as the immediate chaos subsided. Alive. She managed, though her ears were ringing and her entire body felt bruised. "Is it over?" Their answer came from above, where Silas Boone appeared on the canyon rim with a rifle in his hands and murder in his eyes. His expensive clothes were torn and his face was blackened with smoke, but his aim remained steady as he trained the weapon on them. "You meddling bastards!" He screamed, his voice barely audible over the flood's diminishing roar. "You've destroyed everything." His first shot chipped concrete inches from Esther's head, sending stone fragments stinging across her cheek. The second splintered the wooden framework of the maintenance shed, and she realized with cold certainty that their position offered little protection from the high ground Boone commanded. That was when Captain Morrison's cavalry arrived and forced their approach, masked by the chaos of the flood. Federal soldiers swarmed up the canyon walls from multiple directions, surrounding Boone's remaining men and cutting off all routes of escape. "Silas Boone." Morrison's voice carried clearly across the water-carved landscape. "You're under arrest for conspiracy murder and destruction of federal property." Boone's answer was another rifle shot, this one aimed at Morrison himself. But the mining kingpin's desperate position made accurate shooting impossible, and federal marksmen had already taken aim from secure positions. The volley that followed was brief but decisive. Boone toppled backward, clutching multiple wounds, while his remaining supporters threw down their weapons in surrender. As the gunfire echoed away across the canyon, Esther found herself holding tightly to Dakota's hand, both of them shaking with delayed reaction to how close disaster had come. The dam still stood, and the reservoir was draining in a controlled manner that would restore the creek's natural flow, and the corruption that had strangled the Dakota territory for decades was finally broken. "Is it really over?" she asked. The fighting is, Dakota replied, helping her to her feet despite her wheelchair's absence. But the rebuilding is just beginning. He was right, of course. The legal aftermath would take months to resolve, the environmental damage would require years to heal, and the social wounds opened by decades of exploitation would need careful tending. But for the first time since arriving in Crow's Landing, Esther felt genuine hope for what the future might hold. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning in 1874, Crow's Landing witnessed something unprecedented in its brief history. A wedding that brought together not just two people, but two communities that had been kept apart by fear, prejudice, and the manipulations of corrupt men. Esther McKinnon became Esther Red Standing in a ceremony held beside the restored Rabbit Ear Creek, where clean water ran strong and clear for the first time in years. Chief Red Hawk performed the traditional Lakota rituals in the sacred grove upstream from town, his ancient voice carrying blessings that had been spoken over countless generations. Doc Whitaker provided the territorial legal requirements with his customary blend of professionalism and genuine affection for both parties. May Delaney, resplendent in her finest Irish lace, hosted the reception at the rebuilt Silver Dollar. The saloon had been transformed into something approaching respectability, clean floors, new fixtures, and a piano that could sustain notes properly, thanks to Dakota's mechanical skills and Esther's musical knowledge working in perfect harmony. But it was the music itself that made the celebration truly memorable. For the first time in 40 years, the lineage song was performed in its complete form, not just the melody Astrid had preserved, but all the traditional verses that told the story of Red Standing's vision. Lakota elders sang alongside Norwegian immigrants and territorial settlers, their voices blending in harmonies that bridged cultures and honored the complex heritage that had shaped the Dakota territory. Grandmother would have loved this, Esther said to Dakota as they watched their wedding guests dancing to music that celebrated both their traditions. She did love it, he replied gently. Every time you played that song, you were carrying her love forward. Now, our children will carry it further still. Astrid had lived to see justice served and her granddaughter married, passing peacefully in her sleep just 2 weeks before the wedding. Her funeral had drawn mourners from as far away as Yankton federal officials, tribal leaders, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by her quiet courage and stubborn determination to see truth triumph over corruption. The children Dakota mentioned were not yet born, but they were already anticipated with joy that transcended individual desire. When they came, they would learn the lineage song as their birthright understanding from the beginning that they belonged to something larger than themselves, a heritage that honored both sides of their lineage without apology or compromise. Will you teach them to climb? Esther asked her hand, finding his across the space between their chairs. If they want to learn, he replied, his fingers intertwining with hers. But I'll also teach them that some risks are worth taking and others are just foolishness. And I'll teach them music, she said. Not just the lineage song, but all the song's Norwegian folk tunes, Lakota ceremonials, whatever new melodies they create for themselves. As evening fell over the celebration and the sounds of music and laughter continued under stars that seemed brighter than before, the young couple sat together on the porch of their new home, a modest frame house built with lumber from trees that had grown along the restored creek. The structure was designed with Esther's needs in mind, featuring wide doorways, gentle ramps, and a music room where she could perform for private audiences or simply play for her own pleasure. No regrets, Dakota asked as the sounds of continuing celebration drifted across the evening air. None, Esther replied firmly. Even the dangerous parts, especially the dangerous parts. Why especially those? She was quiet for a moment, considering. because that's when I learned who I really was. Not the disabled piano player everyone pitied, but someone who could face down armed men and help save an entire community. The danger didn't diminish me. It revealed what had been there all along. Dakota nodded slowly, understanding exactly what she meant. Red Standing used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important than fear. What was more important to you? Esther asked. When you were carrying me through Hidden Canyon with everything falling apart around us. You, he said simply. Your life, your future. The possibility that we might have years together to explore what we'd started. Their first kiss as husband and wife was gentle, unhurried, flavored with the certainty that they had time, now time to build a life together, time to raise children who would carry their combined heritage into an uncertain but hopeful future. Time to prove that love could indeed grow strongest in the spaces where different worlds chose to become one. Years later, when their 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, asked about the lineage song and the story it told, Esther would explain how music carries memory across generations, how courage can triumph over corruption, and how the most important battles are often fought not for personal gain, but for the right of communities to determine their own futures. She would tell them about Astrid, the Norwegian immigrant who had actually been Lakota by adoption, whose careful record-keeping had finally brought justice to a territory long dominated by corrupt men. About Dakota, the translator who had risked everything to protect strangers who became family. About the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem impossible. But most importantly, she would teach them that heritage is not something you inherit passively, but something you must actively claim and carry forward. The lineage song would continue because each generation chose to learn it to understand its meaning and to pass it on enriched by their own experiences and wisdom. The melody that had begun as a bridge between worlds became in time a foundation for building new worlds communities, where difference was celebrated rather than feared, where justice was pursued regardless of the personal cost, and where love could flourish across any boundary that narrow minds might try to impose. In Crow's Landing, where Rabbit Ear Creek ran clean and strong, the rhythm of that music shaped the lives of all who chose to listen. And in the quiet spaces between the notes, hope built its nest and prepared to take wing across generations yet to come.